Hello everyone, welcome back to the series of 100 videos for 100 cantos of Dante's Divine Comedy. Today I'm going to talk about Purgatorio, canto number 19, which is an amazing canto, one of my personal favorites. Before starting though, since the canto includes a lot of references to Homer, to the Odyssey and to Ulysses, I thought I would talk for a second about the Odyssey, also inspired by two great booktubers. One is Steve Donahue and the other one is Matthew at the Mayberry Book Club, who have been conducting a small book club about the Odyssey, rereading the Odyssey together, and watching their great videos and how they refreshed the Odyssey in my mind, etc., reminded me the very fundamental fact related to the Divine Comedy as well, that Dante could not read the Odyssey. He didn't have any copy of the Odyssey translated available to him. He couldn't understand, he couldn't read ancient Greek, and therefore every quotation or reference that we find in the Divine Comedy that has to do with Ulysses, the Sirens, or anything within the Odyssey Dante had to rely on the Roman poets or Roman writers who referred indirectly to Homer. Only a couple of very important milestones. So first of all, it's understood that possibly the first one who translated the Odyssey into Latin was Livius Andronicus, who lived in the 3rd century before Christ. And his translation obviously didn't survive. There have been many Latin translations of Homer over the centuries after Livius Andronicus. Very likely a copy was present in the Library of Alexandria. Anyway, all those translations that existed completely disappeared and died down in the pit of the death of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire. Now, educated Romans of the Roman Empire, when it was still around until the 4th and 5th century, they read Homer in the original Greek, so maybe there wasn't too great of a demand for translations in Latin. In any case, there were some of them, and they all disappeared before the Western Roman Empire collapsed. 800 years after, in this big hiatus where nobody has seen another Latin translation of the Odyssey, there is this knowledge of this ancient work, and it's been referred to by many different literary works and philosophical works, etc., but nobody really has it. Now, right after Dante's death, what happened, as you probably know, the three giants of medieval Italian literature are Dante, and then Francesco Petrarca and Giovanni Boccaccio. Dante, Petrarca and Boccaccio. Petrarca and Boccaccio are of a generation or a couple of generations after Dante, and they were in part in the inspiring forces or driving forces of bringing back an ancient Greek education into Italy. So it says here on this article that I found, it seems like the oldest surviving translation of the Odyssey in Latin was the one by Leonius Pliatus, who lived during the 14th century and died in 1366. He was called to Florence and held the very first university course in ancient Greek in Florence in the years 1360, 1361, for a couple of years. I've read parts of the mail correspondence between Petrarca and Boccaccio about these translations, and I have to say that I found them hilarious, to say the least, because they were not very courteous, especially Petrarca, in talking about this Leoncious Pliatus. After reading one of the translations made by Leoncious, and in writing a letter to Boccaccio, Petrarca was confessing to Boccaccio. He said that these translations have taken away almost completely the taste and the beauty of the work, of the original work, the Odyssey. for me, is a Petrarca. They look and feel like those foods that it's been necessary to freeze, and the whole operation didn't work out quite well. This is a textual, let's say literal message that Petrarca wrote to Boccaccio about these first translations. We can really understand how difficult it was to find somebody who was qualified and strong enough in ancient Greek to, and also in Latin of course, to produce a sufficiently strong translation of the Odyssey. To be very clear, before literature, and in a way that was much more complete and maybe systematic, we could say, there were many translations from ancient Greek to Latin made by monasteries and wherever there was some cultural activity, but they were mainly limited to fields like philosophy, theology, medicine, and so this is why the works of Aristotle, Hippocrates, Galeno, Averroes himself, the Muslim philosopher, had been translated to Latin, and those Latin translations had survived, not only survived, but some new translations were in the works constantly. It's in the field of literature that the Odyssey falls and fell, and this is why maybe, because of the cultural environment of those times, there was a big delay in addressing that particular translation. Going back to Petrarca's letters, he one day in 1354 received as a gift from Byzantium, from an ambassador in Byzantium, because Petrarca was already a celebrity in those days, a beautiful gift, a copy of the Odyssey in ancient Greek. But Petrarca couldn't understand Greek, and so in his letter back to this person who gifted him the book, he wrote, "Your Homer, unfortunately, is mute in front of me," or to say it better, I am completely deaf in front of him. I'm joyful about just looking at this book. I look at it, I actually often hug the book itself, and while I'm sighing, I say to it, and I say to Homer, "Oh, great man, how ardently I would love to listen to you. I would love to hear your voice, but I can't." Petrarca wrote another letter to Boccaccio saying that the long time that I have spent with that great beast of Leoncious, poor Leoncious, I'm afraid that I have been infected by Leoncious. And I received a new letter from Leoncious that is almost more horrendous and even longer than his dirty beard and hair. So there wasn't a great love between these two men. So let's get to Canto 19. It's, as I said, it's one of my favorite cantos, especially for the central part and for the underlying theme of this canto. We are here, I'm going to show a map quickly of where we are on the mountain. Sometimes it feels like this project is like climbing Mount Everest, and so I'm keeping track very, very carefully. We are now in this canto in the passage between the 4th and the 5th terrace of Purgatorio. So we are moving from the Terrace of Sloth, where we are in the beginning, to the Terrace of Avarice, which is going to be the 5th terrace and where we're going to find ourselves at the end of Canto 19. This canto is easily split in two parts. The first one is Dante's dream, and the second part is the dialogue with Pope Adrian V. It's incredible how Dante's three dreams are positioned in Purgatorio. We have three dreams and three times when Dante sleeps. Each of these moments, each of these dreams, not only have a great significance for what follows and also a prophetic value in themselves, but also they are positioned in very crucial moments. The first one, if we remember, was in Canto 9, just before Dante was approaching the actual door, the official door of Purgatory. The second one is here, and even if this is Canto 19, at the end of Canto 18, this dream was already announced, and so we can see this number 9 structure recurring, 9, 18, and the third dream will be in Canto 27, another 9, so 9, 9, 9. In Canto 27, Dante will have another dream just before the entrance in the earthly paradise. It would be a fantastic scene. Having said this, it's almost impossible to miss the underlying theme of the entire Canto 19. On one hand, you have the dream, on the other hand, you have Adrian V, but really, in both parts, what sustains the narrative and the content is the topic of this double and opposite attraction of human beings towards the earth on one hand and towards heaven on the other, the opposite, and this conflict at the heart of man. And we could see Canto 19 almost as an introduction, a proper introduction and summary of what is going to follow in the next 3 terraces, 5, 6 and 7, where we see the last 3 sins and the last 3 terraces. Because in a sense, we are looking at this sense of incontinence or so-called overindulgence, that all of them have some similarities and some elements that can be linked together much more than the other 4. Sloth has its own little category, and the first 3, pride, wrath, and envy, have their own characteristics. I'll get started with the Mandelbaum translation. In that hour, when the heat of the day, defeated by Earth and sometimes Saturn, can no longer warm up the moon's hand cold, the characteristics of Saturn, the moon, of coldness, and also this characteristic of geomancers who were diviners, are so unpleasant that they could be the equivalent of a introduction soundtrack to a horror movie here. The time is just before dawn in that hour, and both the moon and Saturn were believed to be cold planets, therefore having an effect, a physical effect of cooling down the Earth because of their rays and their effect on the Earth. And then Dante mentions these geomancers. Who were the geomancers? Geomancers were basically diviners. Diviners, and we remember from Inferno 20 what Dante thinks and how he commented about diviners. They were diviners who created charts based on random points traced on the Earth and then linked with lines that were forming a number of preset structures, almost like the constellations, only these were 16 different figures that had specific names, and one of these 16 figures was called Fortuna Major. And this Fortuna Major, in this ancient art of geomancy, was composed by the last stars of the constellation of Aquarius and the first one of the Pisces. So, because from March 21st to April 21st, the Sun is in Aries, which is the constellation that immediately follows the Pisces, then we understand that the Sun is almost gonna come out. Right now we are just before dawn because of this indication. Dante is sleeping, and a terribly, horribly looking woman comes to him in dream. She is a stammering woman, which is a sign that she has lost her power of reason, as well as all the other elements that communicate a certain moral decrepitude and moral decadence. And it's beautiful here. Dante describes her, and then he says, Io la mirava, and puts a semicolon, as if to say this, I looked at her, took some time. He's really fixated with his look into this woman. There is a certain power, a certain magnetism. And just as sun revives cold limbs the night made numb, so did my gaze loosen her tongue and then, in little time, set her contorted limbs in perfect order. Very important element here. This happens because of Dante's gaze. So it's a transformation that happens within Dante's eyes. Very, very important. So we can say confidently, given what the scholars say about this scene, that this ugly woman is an allegory for all the sins of incontinence or overindulgence that we're going to see in the next terraces, all brought together. Then when she is transformed into a siren, this ugly woman becomes the allegory for the fraudulent attraction of earthly goods. This is really the transformation in meaning. Now, it's really the gaze of the man, and here Dante really is playing the role of the everyman, that as if under a spell, he's transforming all the deformities of this woman into something really beautiful and extremely attractive. This is the first introduction to the underlying theme of the entire canto, which is this irresistible attractiveness of all earthly goods, and not only wealth and riches, but all earthly goods for us human beings, and how easy it is for us to overindulge and to sin of incontinence when we are so possessed by this attractiveness. So the woman becomes a siren, and she starts singing in a very sweet way, and it's within her song that she actually mentions Ulysses. She says, I turned aside Ulysses, although he had longed to journey, and we'll see exactly what's behind these lines. But simply, this is a transformation that is subjective, not objective, and therefore Dante is as if he has completely stopped seeing her as she really is. That's really the point. I turned aside Ulysses, although he had longed to journey, who grows used to me, seldom departs, I satisfy him so. As I mentioned in my introduction to this video, this is one of the mentions that Dante makes of Ulysses and the Odyssey without having read the Odyssey. So it's very interesting from a philological standpoint to try and look into Dante's sources. Here, it's probable that Dante used Cicero's De Finibus Bonorum et Malorum, which was a philosophical treatise. In particular, in one of the books of this work, he talked about Ulysses and the Sirens, but Cicero was not really talking about the fact that Ulysses found a way to resist the Sirens. So it's possible, even if we are not sure, it's possible that Dante missed that point, that Ulysses resisted the Sirens, and therefore his Siren in Canto 19 here said, I turned aside Ulysses, even if, in fact, from the Odyssey, we know that there was no Siren who actually was able to turn aside Ulysses. So there is something else going on here. Either Dante misunderstood because misled by the sources, or he knew about it, but he willingly wrote it in this way. Let's remember that Ulysses in Canto 26 of Inferno has been presented as a strong alter ego of Dante. So there is probably something very, very personal every time that Dante talks about Ulysses, and a big portion of it probably we are missing. For example, it's possible that Dante is making us believe here that Ulysses gave in to the song of the Siren, even if he knew that he didn't, because Dante gave in to the song of earthly goods, be it philosophy or be it some woman. For example, we don't know, but it's possible that this description of the ugly woman that becomes beautiful, etc., referred in his autobiography to some women, or a woman or some women that Dante went with after falling in love with Beatrice. Another classical work that Canto 19 is very indebted for is the Constellations of Philosophy by Boethius. It was one of the most influential works of the Middle Ages, and Dante knew it very well, he loved it. And a lot of terms used by Boethius in the book are found here. In fact, in the opening of the book, Boethius talked about Sirens as well, in a similar way to how Dante talks about Sirens over here. Now, we're talking about a man who is overindulging, and therefore addicted to some type of earthly material good. It could be alcohol, it could be career, it could be money, we don't know, but that's the same type of psychological mechanism. And of course, there needs to be an intervention to save this person. And the intervention for the addicted, because it's addiction they were talking about, is by this woman. A woman showed herself alert and saintly. Very mysterious woman. We have no idea who this woman is. Many scholars have many different opinions. Some think that this could be Saint Lucy, because Dante says saintly. Some say she could even be Beatrice. And some say it cannot be Beatrice because he makes a proper introduction of Beatrice later on in Purgatorio. Now, I have a personal opinion, of course, and my personal opinion is that this is probably Beatrice. Beatrice, it's a dream. Dante is dreaming. So why not Beatrice coming in his dream to intervene in this problematic situation and show him the true nature of this woman that is an allegory for all the sins that he was committing. I think it would make sense, and I also think it would make sense that Dante didn't want to say it was Beatrice, and he didn't want to even make it understood, because he knew that Beatrice, from a dramatic point of view, has to make her big entrance at the end of Purgatorio. But here, it would, in my opinion, make sense. I'd love to know what you think. What do you think about this mysterious woman and who she can be? Tearing her clothes and showing me her belly, the stench that came from there awakened me. So it's the combined action of Virgil and this saintly woman that helps Dante seeing again this woman as ugly woman as she really is. In fact, even worse, because there is this sensory shock of the smell coming out of the woman. Now, to make completely sure that we are clear, and as a Catholic myself, Dante is talking here about these vices of avarice, lust and gluttony, all brought together as incontinence. And this reminds us that Christianity as a whole, still today, as a stereotype, is very often interpreted as a set of doctrines that kind of hate pleasures and hate the things of the world, or that we sometimes in the secular world intend as enjoying life. However, that's not true. This is a misinterpretation of Christianity, because really the point of all this allegorical work that Dante is doing here is to symbolize excess, to symbolize addiction. I mean, not the material. Christianity has great, let's say, gratefulness to God for all the things that provide pleasure. One example could be the fact that the very first miracle of Jesus Christ in the Gospel is the one where he transforms water into wine. So here we have God transforming gallons and gallons of water into gallons and gallons of wine, which is a pleasant substance, it's material, very material good. There's nothing wrong with wine in itself. The problem is the addiction. Really, the problem is, or the issue is, to keep the proper perspective between material goods and spiritual goods. The hierarchy of goods needs to be maintained every day of our life for the proper harmony or balance to be in place. And if all this explanation sounds really good from a Christian point of view and proper, it's because it's not coming from my brain, but it's coming from Father Paul Pearson and his excellent book, Spiritual Direction from Dante about Purgatorio, that I've already presented, but I'm going to leave the link down in the description for it. So finally Dante awakes, and Virgil says, "At least 3 times I called you." I've heard a reading of this canto in Italian by a very good actress, and she really raised her voice a lot when she spoke these words, "Al mentre voci t'ho messe," at least 3 times I called you. It makes a lot of sense that Virgil at this time is shouting to Dante to wake him up, to kind of shake him of his torpor. There are 2 or 3 expressions here in the next couple of tercets where Virgil refers with his language to, and Dante, to this concept of double attraction towards heaven and earth in terms of going up and down, raising, sitting down, raising up again. He says here, "I followed him bearing my brow, like one whose thoughts have weighed him down, who bends as if he were the semi-arc that forms a bridge." So Dante takes this stooped position. And then I heard, "Draw near, the pass is here." This is the angel of zeal that we find at the end of the Terrace of Sloth. First of all, the fact that Dante is now seems to be able to see parts of the body of the angel a little better than what he was able to see about the previous angel. So there is a certain progression or progress that he's making with his spiritual view, his spiritual sight. Second, this means the fact that the angel is coming there and interacting with Dante, that his fourth letter P from is erased from his forehead, and so he only has 3 left at this point. And then the angel moved his plumes and, fanning us, affirmed that those qui lugent would be blessed. So this is the movement with his wings that erases the P. And qui lugent means those who mourn, those who cry. A lot has been said and written about the reason why, to counter the sin of sloth, Dante would bring this beatitude, which is, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. He's the angel of zeal, but we thought that the opposite of sloth would be this kind of holy haste or holy zeal. And really, it seems like that's not the case. It seems like the beatitude chosen by Dante is those who mourn. So why is it for sloth? And the reason is probably to be found in St. Thomas Aquinas. For Aquinas, the definition of acidia, or sloth, is tristitia de spirituali bono, or in other words, a certain sadness over one's spiritual goods and or spiritual health. So there is a sense of sadness and almost a sort of depression in the soul, in sinning of sloth. Virgil and Dante proceed, and Dante feels like sharing with Virgil that dream that he just had. And Virgil here seems to say to Dante that he already knows about it. However, some texts say that there was a question mark, apparently, in verse 58 and 59, after the Italian words si piagne and si slega. And this would mean that instead of stating what he has seen in the dream, Virgil would be asking Dante, the one you saw, that ancient witch, for her alone one must atone above. You saw how man can free himself from her. These are two statements. If we read them as questions, it probably would make a little bit more sense as Virgil trying to guess what Dante has been dreaming. Because Virgil doesn't really have a paranormal power to read Dante's mind. He understands Dante as if Dante was a mirror. We know that from Inferno. But he always uses his intuition and his intelligence to understand it. Bastiti e batti a terra le calcagne, which is a quote from the Gospel of Matthew. Fasten your eyes upon the lure that's spun by the eternal King with his greatest sphere. This is the attraction towards heaven, spelled out again by Virgil. And it reminds us of the end of Purgatorio 14, where Virgil expressed the same concept. And finally, with this magnificent simile of the falconer, once again, Dante really loved falconry, and we see a lot of similes that have to do with it. Dante concludes the Terrace of Sloth here. So it's pretty clear that the falconer in this simile is God. Falconer's call bends forward, craving the food that's ready for him there. The food is ready for him there because it was a habit to give a little small part of the prey to the falcon once the prey was caught. So I became. So the falcon is Dante, is the everyman. And so I remained until, through the cleft rock, I reached the point at which the circle starts. Here they are finally. So at this line, between 69 and 70, we can really trace a line, is the end of Sloth and the beginning of the Terrace of Avarice. Everyone is turned face down, basically squeezed against the ground, the earth, and tied. They are saying or praying, adesit pavimento anima mea, which means my soul is sticking to the ground, to the pavement, is really stuck to the pavement. And it's pretty clear from a visual standpoint how this is a contrapasso purification exercise for people who have been focused down towards earthly goods and addicted to earthly goods all of their life, while they should have looked up towards spiritual goods, but they didn't. Or if they did only towards the end of their life, like in the case of Adrian V. This part in Latin, Adesit pavimento anima mea, comes from a psalm in the Old Testament, Psalm 118, even though it's used a little bit in a different context there. But that's where Dante took him from, and this is why it's sung in Latin. And yes, Dante keeps thinking about separation of church and state. This kind of reasoning will culminate in Purgatorio at the very end in Canto 32, where we're going to have a terrible allegory of the church as a prostitute and the empire as a giant. So we're going to see a prostitute and a giant in Canto 32 as a culmination of these two political powers, or powers in general. However, the way that Dante talks about Adrian V in this canto is maybe more personal than political. And here is, again, the beauty of Dante, the beauty of the Divine Comedy, how he always manages to make things real, relevant to us, current and contemporary in an incredible way. If you come here but do not need to prostrate and you will find the path, then keep your right hand always to the outside. The fact that it says do not need to prostrate confirms the fact that in Purgatory the souls don't need to stop at every terrace in order to purify. I, hearing the voice reply, learned what was hidden. What was hidden was the speaker because he couldn't see his face. Dante wants to speak with his soul, and Virgil, with a quick exchange of glances, understands him and allows him to speak. And Dante speaks to the soul, to Adrian V. He asks 3 questions. Who were you? Why are your backs turned up? And is there anything that I can do as somebody who's alive for you? And so Adrian starts speaking at verse 97. Why heaven turns our backs against itself, you are to know. I'm going to tell you why. But first, scias quod ego fui successor Petri. You should know that I was the successor of St. Peter. I was a pope. Adrian V was elected pope in 1276. He was in his role for only about a month, or a little bit more than a month. In fact, Dante himself says, for 1 month and a little more, I learned how the great mantle weighs on him who'd keep it out of the mire, and all other weights seem feathers. The language of Adrian V is particularly poetic. I really love all this portion from verse 100 to 115 or 120. I think it's a personal preference. I think is really the strongest part of this entire canto. The Pope introduces himself in Latin because Latin was the official language of the Church, and his tone is at the same time solemn but also humble. There is no bragging or egomania from this Pope. In fact, both at the beginning of his monologue and at the end, he introduces himself and then says goodbye to Dante with very personal elements of his life. In the beginning, he says, between Sestri and Chiavari descends a handsome river. This is a river that was called Lavagna, and that today can be still found, is called Entella. If I find it, I'm going to show a quick picture of it. An area in Liguria, which is the area of Genoa in Italy, between Sestri Levante and Chiavari. Then I discovered the deceit of life. I saw that there the heart was not at rest, nor could I, in that life, ascend more high. There is a very clear and loud echo of St. Augustine here. One of his most famous quotes, you created us, God, and our heart is restless until it rests in thou. And really this is what Dante is alluding to. Adrian V understood that he had to turn his heart properly and truly towards spiritual goods and towards God. We don't have a historic proof that Adrian V was particularly avaricious or greedy. Once again, we need to look at the broader meaning of avarice, as I've seen here, because it's not only greed, it's in fact cupiditas in Latin, which involves a lot more honor, power, basically all that the she-wolf of Canto 1 of Inferno was representing. All these vices that can fall into avarice but are much broader, always in excess. Again, St. Thomas Aquinas, he said, avaritia est non solum pecuniae, sed etiam scientiae et altitudinis. Avarice is not only of wealth, of money, but also of knowledge and of particularly obsessive glory and excellence. When Adrian says, così scopersi la vita bugiarda, this is a clear and literal reference to Dante's dream. So I discovered the lying life, the bugiarda vita, la vita bugiarda. This discovering really is echoing the fact that the dress of this beautiful siren is opened by Virgil and she is shown for what she really is. And here we can go back to Cicero. In fact, the book I mentioned before, the De Finibus Bonorum et Malorum, that Dante certainly had in front of him while he was writing Canto 19, where Cicero was talking about sirens. However, the way he talks about sirens here is not only omitting what Ulysses did to avoid their spell, but also is saying that men were attracted by the sirens because in particular of the promises the sirens were making of sharing all the knowledge of the world. So there is a sense in Cicero of the sirens being creatures that promise knowledge, a lot of wisdom and knowledge, and this might be something that has particularly hit Dante with his personality and his own particular anxiety to know. So at verse 127, Adrian stops speaking and Dante says, I kneeled, wishing to speak, but just as I began to kneel and threw my voice alone, he sensed that I had meant to do him reverence. We see Dante's respect and love for the church, which is something that is being noted many times. And at the same time, the Pope, Adrian V, is telling him, oh, don't kneel, this is absolutely not needed. Remember, we are in Purgatory, and in Purgatory, the earthly status does not matter. We are all the same here. If you have ever understood the holy sound of the Gospel that says, neque nubent, then you will see why I have spoken so. It's a really beautiful part of the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus is addressed by sardonic people who are asking him, they're talking about the resurrection, and they're asking him who of these 6 brothers will be resurrected and will be, dead brothers will be resurrected and will be able to marry this woman. And Jesus clarifies very simply, saying that after the resurrection, there will be no marrying in heaven, that everyone will be equal. The end of the canto is maybe one of the best parts, really, because it talks about Alagia. Beyond I have a niece whose name's Alagia. She in herself is good, as long as our house by example, and she alone is left to me beyond. She is the only person, this niece of Adrian, who is good and who can pray for him in the real life where the living people are. It's interesting the fact that this Alagia, she was the daughter of Adrian's brother, and of course they were wealthy people, nobility, and during the terrible brutality of Dante's exile, Dante found himself at the residence of Alagia as well, and her family, her husband, and so they talked. So this is almost a homage that Dante pays to Alagia in the Divine Comedy, not only by mentioning her, but by mentioning her in a very, very good light. She is the only good soul remained in Adrian's family. It makes me imagine some moments when Dante was a guest in this place, and just think how weird Dante must have been in general, just behaving, eating at dinner, maybe with his hosts, maybe with Alagia by themselves, or maybe with her husband at the same time, and what kind of conversation they might have had. It's just fascinating to try and imagine that. In any case, Alagia, and this is why I find it so beautiful, because brings back all this talking about popes and philosophies back to our day-to-day reality, she really is a symbol of that familiarity and reality that is made of goodness, of simplicity, let's say, and that in reality is even stronger, of the greatest power in the world, because Adrian reached the absolute highest post in the world. He had nowhere to go higher than where he reached. So, in other words, in this conclusion, we have the man who reached the absolute highest peak of power in Dante's world, asking for the help, begging for the help of a very normal and humble person and good person on earth, which is really beautiful. It also fits well with Dante's general red line in the Divine Comedy and trend of making saving characters who intercede and save people, as female, as women, just like Mary, St. Lucy, Beatrice, etc. A magnificent canto that I personally love very much. I'm sorry if this was maybe a little bit of a longer video, but I hope you found it useful, and I look forward to your comments. Thanks so much.